I'm Yelena Sokova. I'm the Executive Director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you. Some of you may think you have a deja vu because you saw me in that role before. No, it's not a deja vu. I'm back, and I'm really happy to be back at the VCDMP with this fantastic team. But I also want to pay special tribute to Laura Rockwood, who was the executive director of the VCDMP for the last 4 years. And I think she did a fantastic job, grew the center, put it on a new level. And I feel like I have now an obligation to take it even to the next level, which would be hard to beat. We do have a very robust program here at the center with various seminars, other activities, training programs, including for diplomats. We have many events that bring together representatives from national governments, international organizations, academia, and civil society. And today we host another event that brings all you to the table. It's a very important discussion. We know that there is, to put it mildly, not much is happening now in the disarmament arena. It's quite the opposite. We see the sometimes unraveling of the arms control infrastructure. And the panel today that I will introduce in a moment took a different approach, looking at what we can do in the meantime in reducing nuclear risk and maybe looking at possible options of dealing with nuclear materials, fissile materials that are ingredients for the nuclear weapons. It is a very distinguished panel that I'm very pleased to host today. But before I introduce them, I wanted to, for everyone to understand that this event is being recorded and actually streamed live. So you need to take a note of that. The cameras will be on the panel, not on the audience. And if there are, I don't think we finalize how we're handling questions and answers session, but if you have no objection, then we could record the Q&A section as well. But if there are any objection, you can come to me, send a note during the main presentation, and we will not film the Q&A session. Okay, and now for the introductions. We'll start with Professor Sharon Squassoni, my good friend and colleague. She's a research professor at the practice at International Affairs at the Institute for International Science and Technology Policy at George Washington University. Before joining STP, she directed the Proliferation Prevention Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and was a senior scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She had spent half of her career actually working at the US government as a senior specialist in weapons of mass destruction at the Congressional Research Service and as a staff expert within the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency and at the State Department. So she kind of marries both worlds, non-governmental and governmental. The second speaker on the panel would be Dr. Raji Rajogopalan.
Just call me Raji. Let's keep it simple.
Thank you for the kind. She's a distinguished fellow and head of the Nuclear and Space Policy Initiative at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. She's also the technical advisor for a UN group of governmental experts on prevention of arms race in outer space. As a senior Asia defense writer, she's also a senior Asia defense writer for The Diplomat. She also writes a weekly column on Asian strategic issues. And she joined the Observer Research Foundation after a 5-year work at the National Security Council Secretariat, where she was an assistant director. And prior to that, she also worked as a research officer at the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis in New Delhi. Our third speaker would be Dr. Joshan Choi. He's an affiliate of Berkeley Nuclear Research Center at the University of Berkeley and retired from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory after 21 years of service there. He was a project professor at the University of Tokyo from 2008 to 2011 and a visiting professor at Tokyo Institute of Technology in 2012. Dr. Choi also worked at the International Atomic Energy Agency here in Vienna from 1998 to 2001 and was a science fellow at the Center for International Security Cooperation at Stanford University. And prior to that, he also worked for the Bechtel Corporation. And finally, we'll have Dr. Tatsuhiro Suzuki. Tatsujiro Suzuki, who is a Vice Director and Professor of Research Center for Weapons Abolition at Nagasaki University, Japan. And I greatly remember the time you hosted me there. Before joining RECNA, he was a Vice Chairman of Japan Atomic Energy Commission, of the Cabinet Office from January 2010 to April 2014. Until then, he was an Associate Vice President of the Central Research Institute of Electric Power Industry in Japan and visiting professor at the Graduate School of Public Policy, University of Tokyo, and some other academic institutions. He is now a member of Advisory Board of Parliament's Special Committee on Nuclear Energy, and also a council member of PAGWASH conferences on science and world affairs. So as you can see, all of our distinguished panelists have a very broad set of different positions and experiences within government and outside government and in the academia. So I'm really looking forward to your presentation and discussion following it. Sharon, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Yelena. Yelena Sokova is a very brave woman. This is the third event this week. I think it's in your first week back.
Yep.
So we are very, very grateful to you. Also for the opportunity to speak before such a distinguished audience in Vienna. It's always great to speak in front of nuclear experts, as you all are. So we have a diverse set of presentations. 2 of us have slides, 2 of us don't. And I'm going to use my time mostly to set the stage for you. We had a closed workshop yesterday. I'm not going to reveal much about our conversations, but it sort of sharpened my thinking about some of these issues. So you may be asking, why should we be here to talk about fissile material when so many things in arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation are not going very well? You might also ask the question, aren't we done with nuclear? Didn't we do that? And the answer is, from me, not by a long shot. So there are, and the reason is very clear, at least in my mind. You can't take apart the military and the civil uses of the atom. There is still a lot of material in both the military and the civil sectors. And when you look ahead to future nuclear energy plans, for example, some countries are pursuing fast reactors, that could create a lot more plutonium. So I'm going to go through each of these in turn. So from the very beginning, the day that, with all due respect to my Japanese colleagues, the U.S. bombed Nagasaki, President Truman at the same time said that the U.S. would seek the means to control the bomb to protect the U.S. and the rest of the world from destruction. And in that first year, there were multiple plans, and not all of them just looked at nuclear weapons, they also looked at the fissile material. So we had the Atchison-Lilienthal report, we had the Baruch Plan, we had the first UN Atomic Energy Commission report, and the first UN General Assembly resolution in 1957, about 10 years later, which specifically called for this cutoff of fissile material production for nuclear weapons. So we should ask, how far have we come? Well, 4 of the 5 nuclear weapon states have had a production on fissile material for weapons since 1995. And some of those countries have put excess defense material under safeguards, the US, Russia, and the UK. But there's still large military stockpiles. Pakistan, India, North Korea are still producing fissile material for weapons. And even though the stockpiles of highly enriched uranium, especially on the civilian side, have begun to decline, the stockpiles of civil plutonium continue to rise. And we'll have a little more information for you later. And there is still no movement on a fissile material treaty, whether you want to just address production or also stocks. But when you look at this set of issues, the problems and the risks stem not just from military activities, but also nuclear fuel cycle capabilities. And we can debate about which one is more important to address first. But I think we've seen within the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, there have been efforts for decades to try to get some control over the fuel cycle. And most recently, we have been looking at the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran and whether that does too much or too little. That's within the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Outside of the treaty, there's very little leverage. I think you could argue that the nuclear security summits addressed material stocks mostly in the civil sector, but largely left plutonium untouched. There are a few exceptions to that. So I like to ask the question, what mechanisms do we have to look at civil plutonium? And so I've been involved for the last few years in 2 different projects. The first is what I call the Fissile Zeros Futures Project, and if you go online to the George Washington, if you just Google that, you'll find the website. And that looked at 3 different areas of building norms. One was in nuclear weapons, one was in reducing highly enriched uranium and naval fuel, and several people around the room participated in that. And the last was in civil plutonium. And then more recently, I've been, and this meeting is a part of that, a nuclear transparency project that looked quite specifically at South Asia, and very specifically at whether the guidelines for plutonium management, insert 549, might be a vehicle to enhance transparency. Now, my good friend Tatsu will say, "You're just talking about transparency, that's not really reducing risks." And he's going to get to very specific ways of reducing risk. But I'm going to focus on this for just a little bit longer. Just a tiny little bit of background about MCERT 549, these guidelines. They had 4 aims. They were signed in 1997 by 9 countries. All of them had plutonium stocks, although China didn't right at that moment, but has developed stocks. And the aims were to commit to existing standards of security and safeguards, to spur strategic management of plutonium, improve transparency, and enhance controls on international transfers. And in a lot of ways, we talked yesterday about, is that moment kind of gone, right? It was the very end of the end of the Cold War. There was a lot of optimism because we knew that nuclear weapon states would be taking material out of their military stockpiles and declaring them excess. But at the same time, that growth in the civil plutonium stocks was growing, and there was a need to do something about that. 549 guidelines are kind of interesting because they're quite specific about both the military and the civilian aspects of fissile plutonium. They acknowledge both of those. But they're voluntary, right? And that's both what I would call a virtue and a vice. Not all states have been forthcoming to the same extent. We see this within the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the transparency declarations, right? Not every state gives the same amount of information. But at the same time, I would argue that the guidelines have been a useful multilateral counterpoint to what some countries have done unilaterally and bilaterally. And I'll give specific examples. And I argue that they could actually be reinvigorated. Of course, when countries consider whether to undertake initiatives, as Japan has, in terms of being more transparent about fuel cycles, they have to consider, how easy is this to do? How sustainable is it? Is this confidence building? Is it really accurate? We had an excellent presentation just 2 hours ago by Pavel on deferred verification, and a big question with fissile material is, how accurate is your information? There are trade-offs between transparency and secrecy, and then, of course, regional rivalries versus global norms. So I have a few ideas to share with you, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback. How might we reinvigorate implementation of these guidelines? Well, one approach is to improve current implementation of reporting. We could get more and better data. We could adopt Japan's model of reporting. Some countries under 549 actually make declarations about highly enriched uranium, not just plutonium, because 20 years ago, those countries acknowledged that highly enriched uranium stockpiles would be also a concern. And we could also, we could expand membership to those countries that also hold both military and civilian plutonium stockpiles. And those would be India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. That's a big ask, I know. So why would we expand reporting? There are a few reasons. If you're ardent about nuclear energy and the possibility that it may contribute to climate change mitigation, I would argue that more information about nuclear energy and fuel cycle plans are necessary for safety and accountability. And it might also help you gauge the ability of nuclear energy to help combat climate change. It would also be helpful to know a little bit more about the potential for international recycling by countries such as France, Russia, and China. In my view, it's always good to have good data. and the British made the point more than 20 years ago that if you have consistent sets of data over time, that will allow you to make better comparisons and have greater understanding. You could build on the highly enriched uranium reporting and thus help plans towards coming up with verification and confidence in an eventual fissile material cutoff treaty. And then finally, nuclear security leadership. For states outside the NPT, there are really no venues outside of the NPT review conference that provide a process for discussion. If countries joined or decided to adhere to the guidelines, that would be one potential forum. In my view, there's nothing inherent in the guidelines that precludes members of the NPT to make such declarations. You have to finesse the language a little bit, but I think it's doable. But the main problem would be finding incentives for those states to join what I call a stream of information exchange. And the question is whether, instead of that grouping, whether you might want to approach this regionally. We talked a little bit about that yesterday. So I think this is my last slide, yes. So a potential roadmap for implementation would be for reinvigorating the plutonium management guidelines. The existing member states could simply choose to expand their discussions, meet for more time, actually make it more of an active forum. Right now, it's a very minimal meeting once a year. You might say, well, there's so many other high priorities, why should we do this? And my answer to that would be, well, it's kind of easy to do, so maybe we'll look at it and see if it has legs. Within the NPT review conference, I say this only a little bit tongue-in-cheek, the US could choose to make this part of its transparency package in creating the environment for nuclear disarmament. But I believe actually to make this more successful, it has to be a lot more than the United States. I think US credibility right now is fairly low. And then there may be other ways to include member states, whether you work within the NPT or outside the NPT. And one idea we talked a little bit about, although didn't make a conclusion about, was somehow connecting nuclear supply with adherence to the plutonium management guidelines. There's some costs and risks to that. But so that's the end of my presentation. It's a very small niche, there's my Twitter handle, very small niche idea, but I know we're going to hear more from our other panelists, so thank you for your attention on that. Oh, wait.
Thank you, Sharon. Saji?
Thank you, and it's a great opportunity to be back here in Vienna and to be part of this fantastic panel. And I think Sharon has set the stage very well in terms of why we are looking at the broad nuclear security conversations. So I think there have been important efforts, and I think Sharon has again listed a number of initiatives back in the 50s onwards. But even over the last 2 decades, when you look at the nuclear security in particular, I think there have been a good number of efforts taken by countries, but there are still large quantities of nuclear materials still available worldwide. Nearly 2,000 metric tons of weapon-usable nuclear materials are still found in 24 countries and in over 100 facilities worldwide. Considering the fact that it takes only about several kilograms of plutonium, enough to fit in a can of Coca-Cola, or several dozens of uranium, an amount equivalent to the size of a grapefruit possibly, to detonate a nuclear weapon, the security and accounting of these materials will continue to represent a policy imperative for a number of countries as well as for the larger global nuclear community. Even more widely available are potentially more dangerous radiological sources such as cesium-137, cobalt-60, iridium-192, all of which are found in applications including medicine, industry, science. All too often, these sources are found in locations that are somewhat poorly secured, creating major security vulnerabilities. And in the hands of a terrorist organization, a radiological dispersion device, or what you call the dirty bomb, could lead to serious loss of life, environmental impact, and significant economic damage in the hundreds of millions if one were to calculate the high cost incurred by the cleanup and evacuation and so on and so forth. And for a country like India or even Asian countries, I think with large, densely populated centers and considerable availability of these radiological sources, the potential consequences of even a dirty bomb is going to be fairly serious. And therefore, I think the logic or the imperative for concerted global action is fairly evident. It is obvious that it's not a problem that can be solved even within the boundaries of a particular nation state. Given the transboundary, transnational nature of these problems, all states, especially that of the nuclear states, should be part of the global conversations on this subject. And the security-related as well as energy-related compulsions suggest that nuclear materials and technologies, despite the inherent dangers involved in these materials, they are not going to disappear in the near future. Hence, there's a need for coming up with new institutions, new mechanisms, much more innovatively than what we have done to avoid some of the vulnerabilities in this area. Let me just talk about a little bit of the Indian nuclear security policies and practices, a subject that I guess you will not be hearing too much in the global community. But I think India has dealt with this issue for a long time, given the kind of nature of neighborhood that we have been living in. India does not live in a particularly benign neighborhood. There are all sorts of political and security related disturbances in the neighborhood, insurgencies of various kinds, terrorism and so on and so forth. So nuclear security has been of enormous importance to India. But at the same time, I think we have not really, where we have gone wrong possibly is that we don't talk about our nuclear security policies and how these are done, what are the vulnerabilities, where are the weakness in the policy implementation and so on and so forth. And therefore, I think I would try and spend a few minutes on that. So primarily, India has approached the nuclear security from 5 different perspectives, looking at strengthening governance, institutions, security practice and culture, technology, and international cooperation. And I think among the 5 principles, security culture has remained particularly important for a number of different reasons. Even as technology continues to be important, there are many technological solutions that can be employed in the nuclear safety and security arena, and thus reducing the human element, but technology has its limitations as well. As one of the US Department of Energy security czar, Eugene Habiger, said, good security is 20% and equipment, security is 20% equipment and 80% people. And I think therefore, and especially in the current context, we are increasingly looking at the insider threat issues and so on and so forth. The human element is of extreme importance, and therefore the kind of security culture we are able to inculcate within a particular power plant or civil nuclear power plant, or even in the broader nuclear context, I think it's extremely important. And I think this is something that India has been paying attention to even in the last few years, but we have not really talked about as much. And some of the major highlights of the security culture and practice include defense in depth, personal reliability program, and the design basis threat, among other issues. So defense in depth principle that's been applied at every stage, starting from the construction to operation of a nuclear power plant. This is in line with the IAEA safety and security standards that is linked closely to the issue of physical protection of a facility. Clearly, the IAEA has come out with a number of different reports on this particular aspect, and I think keeping in this mind, the plants that have been constructed by India have many of these principles in play, including several access control mechanisms, including physical measures such as spike strips and barriers, also technology-aided systems such as the biometric. Second important aspect that I look at is the personal reliability program. And this is continued to be one key component of in ensuring India's nuclear security, particularly significant from an insider threat perspective. This includes thorough vetting of a person's background, and this has been done for all the staff and employees, including those responsible for command and control. We came up with ORF had done a study first time in 2014, where looking at the nuclear security policies and practices in India. And this was done based on field visits, so we traveled to some of the civil nuclear power plant sites, as well as extensive interactions with the atomic energy agencies, as well as the security managers in India. So what we found during that particular interactions was that the Indian agencies were doing thorough vetting process up to the level of the temporary employees, but not to the up to the level of contractors, but not to the level of temporary workers who work with a particular firm, maybe for 2 weeks or up to a month or something. I understand the issues behind doing this kind of. It's very, very difficult to, if somebody is going to be associated with a particular firm for as little as 2 weeks or 10 days, it is going to be very difficult to gather the data of that particular person. And this is something that we highlighted in our report, that this security vulnerability must be addressed. Because the response given by the atomic energy agencies and some of the agencies we spoke to, as well as the power plant operators, that, oh, these people do not have access to the core of the facility, so they don't really present a vulnerability out there, so we don't have to worry about it. But my point is that we don't have to leave for them to find a way to get to the core of the facility, so we need to kind of address this right away. But this is something that has been addressed in the last few years. We have had a couple of updated reports since then. Even last year we came out with a report looking at the nuclear security policies and practices, but at the same time also to keep up with the Nuclear Security Summit and the attention to this particular issue. So we did interact with a lot of the folks back again, and we have found that this has been an issue that has been addressed in the last. So that's a good thing that's happened in a sense. Second, another third aspect is India's nuclear security practice is the design basis threat approach that India has put in place. This has remained an effective measure wherein safety and security are integrated from the time of preparation of a nuclear installation design. And so this has been a key aspect of India's nuclear security policy. But I think one area where India has having done a lot of these pretty stringent measures in terms of vetting of the people, keeping the nuclear security aspect and the insider threat perspective and so on and so forth. Where India has lagged behind is in terms of talking to the world as to how India does secure its nuclear facilities, its nuclear transportation, and so on and so forth. So one of the key recommendations that we have been trying to make is to have strong development and outreach efforts, so that especially at a time when India is looking at integrating with the global proliferation architecture, it makes sense for other countries to know what India is doing in this domain before they can support India's case, whether it is the nuclear suppliers case, group membership case, or any other integration process that India has been looking at. I think other countries need to know first and foremost how India is tackling the issue of nuclear security, and especially given the kind of neighborhood that India is in, we have to talk about this. Again, nobody is talking about leaking, giving out the state secrets, but at the same time, having certain even controlled transparency measures, having certain policy measures out in the open, even in broad terms, I think that would go to help India's case than actually other way around. So I think that's one of the primary things that India has to do. One of the first and foremost focus area is to talk about India's policies and practices. And I think India has also to look at the whole issue from the fact that nobody has a foolproof system. Everybody tends to make errors. There could be mistakes, there could be errors. And India has to approach this issue from a sense of confidence that we are doing our best, we are doing the technology, we are doing the human enablement as best as possible in terms of providing the training and so on and so forth. So I think this is something that India has to do and which is not being paid as much attention. One other area that India has to tackle is again within the domestic context, is the need for an independent nuclear regulator. I think this has been coming up repeatedly in various debates. Right now we have the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board, which has been regulating the nuclear sector. But the fact that the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board, or the AERB, continues to depend on the Department of Atomic Energy for a number of different functions, whether in terms of financial and other administrative support, there has always been the question as to how independent the AERB is in coming out with the audits and making those clear recommendations when almost all the facilities run by India are of that of the DA, the Department of Atomic Energy. So there is a clash of interest issue out there, and therefore the independent nature of the AERB has been in question. There have been a number of different Atomic Energy Agency folks who have written on this, and I think this is something that has come up repeatedly in the Indian context. So in 2012, the government of India decided that they will come up with a new measure, replacing the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board, something called the NSRA, the Nuclear Safety Regulatory Authority Bill. This bill was introduced in the Parliament in 2012, but in the next couple of years we went into the election mode, the bill lapsed, and it has not been reintroduced in the Parliament in the last 5 years that the Modi government was in office. One can be hopeful that it is going to be reintroduced in the Parliament fairly soon, now that we have a second term of the Modi government in office. So that's something we are hoping that it would come about, and this would lead to a more instituting a truly independent regulator through the NSRA, the Nuclear Safety Regulatory Authority Bill. That's primarily from the Indian context. If there are questions, I can get back to it later. But just want to spend a couple of minutes also on the global scheme of things in a sense. Clearly, I think given the kind of the range of issues with regard to nuclear security, the vulnerabilities, I think clearly we need new rules of the road in the form of either a convention on nuclear security along the lines of the IAEA Convention on Nuclear Safety that could be looked at. That's one possibility. But the need to categorize global standards and regulations covering both civilian and military nuclear material through a comprehensive instrument such as a convention could be useful and could be looked at in a sense. Even as there is a broader agreement on nuclear security among major powers, I think there have been the political difficulties that have come to play a spoiler's role in today's time, preventing greater participation in nuclear security efforts in a sense. And I would look at for instance, Russia's absence of the 4th Nuclear Security Summit as a reminder of some of the great power difficulties that we have today in a sense. Second aspect I talk about in this regard is the need for an inclusive process. And I think the NSS was to some extent a good example. It brought together different stakeholders. It brought together the expert NGOs, civil society community. It also brought together the industry community, thereby expanding the number of stakeholders interested in this area, involved in this process, and also to create some sort of to keep some pressure on the governments to remain focused on nuclear security and so on and so forth. So I think having a larger base of that kind, creating a larger support base for nuclear security is an important aspect, and that kind of an inclusive process can go a long way in strengthening the global attention on nuclear security. There have been also talk about having a regional approach to nuclear security. I would agree with the need for a regional approach, whether it is in the case of Southern Asia, Central Asia, Europe, and so on and so forth. But I would continue to argue that nuclear security is a global issue, and therefore we have to treat that issue as such. Regional centers, such as whether it is the Indian Global Center for Nuclear Energy Partnership, or the China Centers of Excellence, or Pakistan Centers of Excellence, can be used to create global conversations. So my argument is that you need to use these regional centers of excellence, but use those platforms to create global conversations, because nuclear security is not a regional issue, it is a global issue, and therefore it has to be treated with that importance in a sense. One of my final points is to say we need to have an enhanced support and role for the IAEA, and I think this has been heard repeatedly in many different forums. But again, how do we strengthen the role of the IAEA if there are clearly lacunae in terms of the human resources as well as financial support? So how do we go to make the role of the IAEA more effective if it has to be able to contribute to the nuclear security cause? This has been a long-standing demand for a lot of different states, but I think the human resources, the lack of adequate number of resources, both in terms of human as well as the financial resources, has been a problem, and therefore I think this is something that we need to think about. Instilling a strong sense of nuclear security culture, again, that is, it goes without saying that I think security culture remains one of the most critical factors in assessing and improving the nuclear security practices, be it in the civil or in the weapons domain. This has a particularly important role, like I said, in tackling insider threats, whether it manifests in the form of cyber threats or even physical protection. And I think this could be translated by having, for instance, facility-wise or even within a country on a more holistic basis, targeted training programs, having specialized modules on nuclear security culture, involving everyone from a facility janitor to a lab researcher to a technician and so on and so forth. I think, and of course including the security guards who remain critical in ensuring the physical protection of a particular firm. A related point, and I'm going to stop here, is the trustworthiness program to periodically validate the reliability of every single employee that's been employed in a particular firm. I think, again, these can be strengthened if you are able to come up with very specific modules and programs that can be used to strengthen the nuclear security culture within a particular firm, within a particular plant, and so on and so forth. I think I'm going to stop here. I've been taking more than enough time. Thank you, and
thank you,
questions and comments.
Thank you, Raja. You went with a different aspect of things when it comes to nuclear material risks. And the next is George Shard. I think we're going back to
So
materials, right?
How do I get the slideshow. Yeah, thank you.
This presentation.
That one. I only have 4 slides, but I wanted to follow what Sharon has laid out. Focus on the InfoCert 549, which is a declaration of plutonium, management of plutonium from 9 countries, and then try to extend from there to argue that if we're looking into reduce the plutonium risk, how can we do it? And how can we enlarge, maybe getting more membership to join the InfoCert 549. So with that, okay. So I give you the accounting of that 9 countries' annual declaration, starting from 1998, which they declare in December 1996, they're counting. This is every year, the 9 countries giving in there. I put them into 2 groups, 1 and 2, but the sum of these 2 groups is the green line. The line above is simply just I included the excess plutonium from the US stock. So that pretty much like a constant number and give you that. And again, this is a 20 years of declaration. I compared that the first declaration in 1996 to the last one that you can see in the InfoCert 549 and give you the trend and what has been going on. The total, again, you have to look into it, it's almost double. But having said that, then each individual country has a specific number in there. So I want to go through that specific number. But before that, I wanted to also say the original intent of InfoCert 549 is not looking into this doubling. They simply just declare what they have. What the fact that it become doubling and creating a lot of opportunity for people like Sharon and say, well, why are you doubling? I mean, how can we see this number go down rather than keep on going up? So that is my motivation in looking into how do we reduce that plutonium risk. Looking into specifically 3 countries out of the 9, I use the word soft landing. Well, they don't have that policy to begin with, but Switzerland and Belgium currently have no plutonium. And also they will phase out nuclear power too, and that will be the case for Germany. Soft landing means when they don't have reactor, at the same time they don't have plutonium. That's the happy story. Japan was following the same way, but Japan program is under stress, especially importantly in the last one, Fukushima. With Fukushima happening, Japan is not going to build new nuclear power plant for a long time to come. So with that, but Japan already have started constructing the Rokkasho reprocessing facility intended to solve the spent fuel problem from a waste disposal standpoint. But also they would separate plutonium in Rokkasho, put it into JMOT, and then trying to recycle that in existing reactor. What the argument comes in is sooner or later people are going to look into if you operate Rokkasho in the full capacity, you will definitely produce more plutonium than what you can consume in the existing reactor. If you reduce the capacity of Rokkasho, that will be very expensive. Basically, that's what the argument comes in. I believe that Japan will be able to handle that. I use the word prolonged landing. That means it take a bit longer time, but eventually it will get there. The US has an alternate plan for this landing process. The US, I'm talking about the 34 ton of plutonium, excess plutonium that's with Russia on the PMD, agreement. They would originally the plan is take the 34 ton, go full marks, and put it into 5 reactors, 2 tons per year. In 17 years, you will give up. You will basically run down that 34 ton of excess plutonium. But unfortunately, the process in going is very expensive. So they change course at this point. At least thinking about dilute and disposing in an existing repository called WIP, and that would take some activity because by diluting, what material you are diluting it with. So those are the issues you need to look into, and whether the WIP capacity will be able to accept that. I suggest a few numbers here based on my understanding of the criticality safety limit on each of the package to send to WIP. So that is the number. But in reality, that number will be based on the right sets of criticality safety limit and also the material that mix with that dilution. So that's the alternate landing plan. With that, then the next, then what we cannot forget France. France is operating a successful recycling business. They have La Hague, still separating plutonium from their own reactor, and used to be others too, from Germany to Japan. So that business is giving them an opportunity to try to maintain that inventory as stable as possible. I choose the word diverging, cruise control. They would like to keep this business go on as long as possible. The no landing, UK has no landing. Well, UK's Magnox reactor has to be reprocessed because of safety reasons. After you reprocess it, you get the plutonium. UK doesn't have the right kind of reactor to use those plutonium. So those plutonium keep on accumulating to 110 tons now. So how do you do that? And sure, UK can build reactor, but it takes time. So the suggestion I have here, from no landing into a cooperative landing, is that there are PWR in France that is still able to take MOX, because the French MOX program does not use up all the PWR. So will there be a cooperating agreement? This is a suggestion. Okay, this is a suggestion that it would take the MOX take the plutonium from UK, MOXify it in Magnox, and put it into a PWR. Electricity generated can transmit it back to UK, and the cost and economic aspect of it need to be worked out. So it's a suggestion that we can see the 110 tons of UK stock, which is the dominating portion of the total, have a chance to reduce. Otherwise, it will stay there. That will be the base for the InfoSys 549 if they are not going to reduce their 110 tons stock. The last one is besides the 9 countries, there are other, there are two of the 9 countries, Russia and China, and just getting off into MOXify some of this separated plutonium in Russia, put it into the fast reactor. China also have a similar plan. They will reprocess part of the light water reactor spent fuel, and they're experimenting that and putting into the CEFR, experimental fast reactor. And at the same time, I believe that South Korea have interest on going into separating them by a pyrochemistry. All these are called what they're waiting for takeoff. So we have landing, but we also have country interest to take off too. So that is the reality we have to look into. My last slide is looking into what now is not reducing. Can we have a transparency and trying to increase other members of the community to join in? And of course, the challenging is DPRK. They have the interest of denuclearization. I would argue and say, what will happen to that plutonium when they finally, if it ever possible to happen, denuclearize? So they could actually verify they send to China, Russia, or any of the P5. That's, that I believe that will happen, because that's the only way that we see that plutonium can leave DPRK. But before it happen, I will also argue that it will be to the advantage of DPRK simply just declare whatever they wanted to denuclearize the plutonium into the InfoSearch. Just use the US as an example. US has declared 50 tons and actually sign an agreement with Russia of 34 tons. Excess plutonium they were using in the defense or military program. So that example is there. How about India, Pakistan, and Israel? India, I would argue that they have a CSA signed in 2005. That CSA, in my opinion, is make India obligated to use the civilian plutonium for peaceful uses. So that amount of civil plutonium that going to be declared in the CSA could easily and straightforward to join into the InfoSearch. Pakistan can take the sample from China, because from day one, when China joined this InfoSearch 549, they declared they don't have any civil plutonium, zero. From 1996 to 2009. So every year, civil plutonium in China was zero until they have small separations of that spent fuel. So that example is also there too. The hard one, of course, Israel has to evaluate based on their pros and cons and see whether they join or not. That last statement actually applies to all countries. Every country should look into the pros and cons of joining the InfoShare. Thank you.
Thank you. So we covered both the enhancements from increasing the material, the information that is provided in the declarations or reports to the IMSERC 549, and you were speaking more about the horizontal expansion and adding additional countries. It's very interesting. Dr. Suzuki,
Okay, thank
now
you.
it's your turn.
All right, thank you. I think Dr. Choi's presentation was a good introduction for me because I'm going to focus on Japan's plutonium stockpile and what Japan can do to contribute to reducing the global nuclear risk from the plutonium stockpile. This is the result of the working group set up by the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, which I chair this group. Well, the group was set up last year in September, called the New Initiative for Nuclear Energy and Nuclear Non-Proliferation. The members include very diverse range expertise, including 3 ex-ambassadors, this very heavy group, and also both pro and anti-nuclear energy people. So the first task for me to set the principle that this working group will not take any particular position on the nuclear energy and also nuclear fuel cycle, but we try to agree on the consensus base to make recommendations on how to reduce the global nuclear risk. Okay, so the first set of recommendations we concluded, just published in June 4th. You can go to the website of this Sasakawa Peace Foundation report. You can download the report. It is only a 5-page recommendation, so it's easy to read. So there are 5 recommendations. The first one is that Japan should start with declaring so-called excess civilian plutonium, and then put those excess civilian plutonium in the custody of IAEA. This is a concept, so-called international plutonium storage, but this is just Japan can voluntarily declare those excess plutonium and put into the IAEA control. And in addition to the IAEA safeguard, this is Japan should give up some control over this excess civilian plutonium. The problem is, the difficulty is how to define the excess civilian plutonium. It's not easy. There are various options we discussed, but we reached the conclusion that maybe this is the best way is to define so-called reasonable working stock, which is actually included in IMSAC 549. So we recommend the Japanese government should define this so-called reasonable working stock, and then the rest should be called excess and put into the IAEA custody. But while doing it, Japanese government should listen to the IAEA expert group to the reasonable so-called how you define the reasonable working stock. Actually, the paper done by Johnson Choi on this subject was very useful for our discussion. So actually, the numbers you gave us was roughly 2 to 3 years stockpile, which I tried to put into the report, which we couldn't. But this is the kind of reference we can think of. Okay, but another question is how to recover the plutonium from those IAEA storage. Then again, this is should be reviewed by the IAEA expert group, but Japan should present the plutonium disposition plan so that they can withdraw from the storage. That's the first proposal. One more important thing. Until this excess plutonium becomes zero, Japan should restrain the pace of reprocessing. This is another very important recommendation. Okay, the second recommendation, this is going to the IMSAC 549. Based on the new Japan Atomic Energy Commission's policy published last year, which is for the first time the Japanese government say we commit to reduce plutonium stockpile, and various other also policy measures were presented. We take that Japanese new policy to be the new norm of the INFSAC 549, which is basically three things. One is the all stockholders should declare that we should reduce existing stockpile and declare the policies how to do that, and then to reprocess only when the demand has been clarified. So those are three set of policy proposals they made, a policy they made at the Japan Atomic Energy Commission. We take that package to the INFSAC 549. That's recommendation 2. That's 3. The third recommendation is that, but those are basically Japan's action and also INFSAC 549. But in order to reduce plutonium stockpile in global wide, we propose international forum should be set up among the 5 largest plutonium stockholders, which is Japan, US, UK, France, and Russia. And currently, each country is struggling to reduce its own plutonium stockpile. The purpose of this forum is to have to explore possible international cooperative scheme for reducing the stockpile much faster with probably in a less expensive way. And for instance, that the UK has already proposed to take the ownership of Japanese plutonium stored in UK, and Japan can pay the UK to dispose now the UK stockpile after they take the title. So if you do that, Japan doesn't have to ship plutonium from UK to Japan, which will reduce the risk of plutonium transportation. So that's one example, but there are other ways that you can probably discuss how to cooperate each other among those 5 largest plutonium stockholders. Recommendation 4, this goes back to Japan regarding Japan nuclear fuel cycle. We agreed that the first priority of what to do with the spent fuel is the priority to the dry gas storage rather than reprocessing. And in the meantime, Japan should set up an independent third-party group to assess all the options of nuclear fuel cycle. This has been done in Japan, but not by the so-called independent agency. It's been done by government agency, which is already pro-nuclear fuel cycle. So we propose is that we need an independent third party which does not take any position on the nuclear fuel cycle. So that's the recommendation 4. The final recommendation is which specifically goes to Japanese government. Japan should play a leading role in this new international norm. Japan is a very, so far, it's basically following international norms, but I think Japan can set up the new norms by itself. So this is a more asking Japanese government to play a more leading role, because this is very important, as Joshan Choi suggested. The international concern over Japanese plutonium remains, and so this, if Japan can play a more leading role, this will reduce international concern in the region, and it could be set up a good example for the countries in the region, like China, as you say, China and maybe ROK could pursue nuclear fuel cycle. So those are the 5 recommendations we made, and I hope that we can discuss. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's very interesting to hear about the specific country policies in this respect. The way we're going to handle it is we'll open the floor to Q&A at the moment. And as I promised at the very beginning, if there are any objections or reservations, we will not video it. Or we are not doing it. We're not doing it? Okay, so we're not doing it. Feel free, ask any questions, and I encourage people to.
Feet on the table.
Okay, but in this regard, I just, if we're finishing the filming, I don't know, it's the whole live streaming, I just want to thank you before we cut off.